Everyone, and welcome back to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. My guest on this program talked with me last before the launch of a current series called Daredevil Black Armor, and I am delighted on this episode to be talking again now at the end of the series with author D.G. Chichester. D.G. or Dan? Which would you prefer?
Dan sounds we've known each other for a while now, so
That's right. That's right. At
at
least
least
months.
months. So
Yeah.
in months. So Dan is fine, Jason. That's great. Yeah, DG is this pretentious thing for credit boxes and such.
Gotcha, gotcha. All right. It's the author name. Absolutely.
Exactly,
Absolutely.
the nom de
One must.
plume. Yes.
Yes. So I have a couple of questions, but I am
Yeah.
curious. You said you had a question for me.
Well, I and we can leave this to the end, or you can answer this now. But
Hmm.
I was curious, especially with your literary background and your approach to comics, from a more, I'll say, literate, point of view,
Hmm.
what you thought of the series now that you've read the whole thing,
Yeah.
and what, if anything, you think makes it work, assuming it does work, or what
Yeah.
doesn't make it work.
Yeah. Well, I'll be glad to share about that. First of all, I have a love of the character and a love of what you've done with the character that is something that I've had for quite a while. So the nostalgia aspect of it works very well. And then I was
Mm-hmm.
actually talking with a friend of mine, and we were talking about how there's kind of a an aesthetic or an appeal to it that feels like it's that classic kind of storytelling, but in a
Mm-hmm.
really modern way. So we both felt that that worked really well, and you keep it centered on Matt Murdock as well. I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that. There are lots of things happening around Matt Murdock with
Mm-hmm.
lots of different characters. One particular appearance in the last issue that I won't give away, and some things like that. But, when you have a story with a character who is kind of on the down and out, who faces a crisis of any
Mm-hmm.
kind, and you're already invested in that character, I feel like that's a good story. Those are ingredients for a really good story. It's fun, and there are all of those things working at the same time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's a good point of view to take in, because I think people have liked it. That's
Hmm.
been my general impression. I haven't heard from a lot of negative, type of things, but it's good to get that deeper assessment. So I appreciate that.
Anytime, anytime. Always glad to give an opinion,
Uh-huh.
and at least one person's perspective. But yeah, and I would love to see, continuations. But we'll of course get to that as one of the last things that we'll talk about as far as
Sure.
what's currently in your creative focus. Um, so let's maybe back up to the beginning and kind of explore the idea of what was it like for you to return to the character? Because for me as the reader, again, nostalgia, it took me back. But how was the process for you?
Much easier than I thought it would be. I really kind of expected to mentally, not that I was feeling intimidated or hesitant, but I sort of thought I would.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
there'd be that, why don't I feel this way? This I haven't touched this or thought about touching this for, 20, plus years, 25 years. Um, but I didn't feel that way at all. And I really just kind of approached it as I, I felt I needed to reacclimatize myself somewhat to the world.
Hmm.
And I did that not necessarily by reading my own work, but just the kind of the surround, the Chip Zdarsky, work that was most recent.
Hmm.
Mark Wade, was one that I wanted to look at. Um, and those weren't to try to compare myself, like, oh, geez, how can I be like this one or that one, or what's considered good modern stuff or whatever.
Hmm.
It was just kind of to make sure I got the world, which I did, very quickly. It felt that way. The toughest thing was looking at the logistical corner that I had put myself in, not expecting that I was going to be leaving the book when I did, or was essentially taken off the book. But
Hmm.
I had set up, and this isn't giving anything away for folks who haven't read it. There's a separate persona that Matt Murdock has to assume. This Jack Batlin character, this grifter character that he takes on because he has faked his death and people presume Matt Murdock is dead,
Mhm.
which was something I was going to work out many years ago. But returning to this space in time, I had to I had to go back into that place because Marvel at that point had destroyed the Black Armor
Mhm.
almost immediately thereafter. So there wasn't any wiggle room. It was either, well, he was Jack Batlin or not Jack Batlin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I sort of assumed that this was going to be a really tough haul. But what I found actually very quickly was that that became a really good space for me to explore Matt's relationship with the law and his thinking about it and the way that he would then solve for it, which was by using this Jack Batlin character as a front for this street legal uh, street corner law operation, so he could give legal advice to people and get his law fix
Mhm.
and be Matt Murdock, which I knew I, as a writer and a reader, and I knew readers would be much more interested in a Matt Murdock story than they would a Jack Batlin story.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
it was, in the essence of it, really easy, and I think that made my flow much better.
Now, well, I'm sure there were parts of the story that have been going through your mind for some time, and in
No,
one way or another. No.
honestly, Jason, no, I'm gonna say not at all. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, there was no point in the last 25 years I thought about a what if or a if only I'd had one more issue or anything like that. It was sort of like I was done.
Mhm.
I was ended. The only time I thought about it in between was when Tim Toohey, who was the interim editor before the Kevin Smith run began,
Mhm.
and the Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada run, when Tim had asked me and Lee Weeks to come back and do this one issue as the sort of ended the first volume. That was the only time I had returned, and that had nothing to do with this. So this was just really the first time I'd sort of tried these things back on and said, well, what will we do with this?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Cool. Very cool. And I'm glad that it sounds like you picked it right back up, and uh,
Yeah,
that it
yeah,
flowed very well.
it was. I think that's as I said, I think the key to the success of this is just to wait 25 years between issues. That's
That's it. It's a long game. It's the long game.
it's the long game. Yes, exactly. Prepare myself.
That's right. Now you have some fun, which I really enjoyed in the issues
Yeah.
with the Black Armor, and you've got a couple of comments about it here and there. Curious about kind of what it was like to bring that experience to it, and also curious about any other Easter eggs, any hints about any of those that readers
Yeah,
can look for.
sure. Uh, so famously or infamously, for many years, if people interviewed me or asked me about the black armor, or that costume,
Hmm.
I would say I never called it that
Yeah.
because, to me, it was a suit, it was a uniform, it was, I never called it black armor. When sales decided to call the book Black Armor, I, of course, bought into that 100,
Right.
110%. That's what you're going to call it. That's what I'm going to call it. So in every time I have Daredevil say that throughout the story, I never called it that, which he does one or two or three times.
Mhm.
Essentially, that's me saying that over the last,
Yes.
25 years. So a couple other, I used to be, I think I would overindulge my tendency for in jokes or references many years ago. And I think I policed myself very well this time. And everything that kind of came up was more or less a very organic piece of business. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
when he says at one point, Daredevil says to the Kingpin, I'm not as forgiving as the other guy. That's a callback to issue 300, where he says to the Kingpin, I forgive you, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
that's sort of the end of that.
Yeah.
Uh, Fall from Grace, which is the storyline where this armor came out of, begins in the first issue with this statement of uh, these are the facts and they are indisputable. It's sort of
Hmm.
like, it sort of sets up everything that's going to happen. And that gets repeated a couple of times throughout the story. So at the end of this storyline, there's a side to that, and Daredevil says, or Matt Murdock says, it's not a fact, and it's not indisputable. So that's kind of like a nice rhythm, which I hadn't planned for, but it
Mhm.
kind of came out of it. There's one point where he's got his manipulations in full run. I was like, Daredevil is kind of like a little bit of a manipulator. And he says, I'm not laughing. I shouldn't laugh, as he's unleashed this chaos, like on Von Strucker's base, which
Uh-huh.
is a little bit of a playback to when he was taking down Fisk's empire in the Fall of the Kingpin story. He says something like, I'm not smiling. I shouldn't smile. Like,
Mhm.
as everything's going to hell for the Kingpin, and he's standing there on a ledge, smiling, grinning like a gargoyle.
Yeah.
Um, the shirtless Strucker scene where Netho did this amazing Von Strucker, who just decides to take
Mhm.
his tunic off and be bare chested in the ring, was an homage I had asked for to Butch Guice, who had been the artist I worked with on Shield,
Mhm.
and we had resurrected Von Strucker from the dead and brought him back to lead Hydra again. And for whatever reason, for whatever reason, Butch just decided to draw him without his shirt 90% of the time. I didn't ask for it. I didn't question it, but it was always this strutting, sort of figure. And I just cracked up about it all the time. And I said, well, if we're going to have Strucker at some point, we have to have him be the shirtless one. Um,
Absolutely. Love it.
Probably the only indulgent, I'll say, in joke in there was there's one of the characters from Hell's Kitchen who gets kidnapped. This woman Trina is talking to her friends on the street, and she's revealing that she has multiple degrees. And so she says she has a graduate degree in architecture from Wentworth Institute of Technology,
Mhm.
which is where my son's going.
Oh,
So
I
that
love
was
it.
my one indulgent bit of business. And I would say it's not a sort of a reference or an in joke really, but so much of Strucker's um, uh, point of view, and even some aspects of his monologue language,
Mhm.
uh, not directly lifted, but certainly inspired by Douglas Rushkoff's Survival of the Richest, which is a fairly recent book that's just about the tech billionaires and the tech lords and the oligarchs that
Mm.
sort of rule our society, and their actual real points of view on the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much of what he's talking about, and he's saying, only the strongest can survive, and we are here, we are the sharp blade that dominates and destroys. It's the actual point of view of some folks. So there was a lot of channeling there to make that work.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. I always love hearing the stories of how much goes into the process of writing and creating these books. And so,
Mm-hmm.
down to the reference to your son's college. I love that. Love how that's on the
That was fun.
page.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
said, show this to your dean.
That's right. That's right. Um, so did you accomplish what you were after in the character? Was there a particular place that you wanted to take the character without giving anything away, of course. I don't do
Yeah, yeah,
spoilers.
yeah. The I mean, I felt my mandate and my assignment, if you will, from the editors and the folks I was dealing with at Marvel, was to just tell a really good adventure, a worthwhile adventure
Hmm.
with this costume in this time, which had sort of been shortcut and undermined and dismissed and treated sort of shabbily in a way. Not
Hmm.
me necessarily, but even the whole setup and the surround. And you establish this kind of costume, and then they didn't just put it in a closet. They'd actually done an issue where they literally destroyed it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
uh, uh, and so I felt like, tell a really good story in a what if sort of way. What if there were all these other adventures that took place with this costume that we just never happened to see?
Mm-hmm.
and do that in my way, in the way that maybe if I was to finally define what I was good at with Daredevil, which was really strong action, maybe occasionally slightly bonkers situational type of things, some really sharp dialogue, a fairly cocksure attitude to the character when he's not being beaten to a pulp.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a little bit of planning ahead and big immersion in the senses, trying as much as possible as somebody who is sighted to feel the world he's in and
Mm-hmm.
communicate that as best I could, which I think I can communicate better now than I could then. And I did an okay job of it then. So that was what I wanted to do. In the old days, I probably would have tried to do a lot more ham-fisted Joseph Campbell, hero's journey type of things,
Uh-huh.
which I steadfastly avoided. And anytime I felt myself slipping into that, I would walk away from the keyboard. The old habits would, try to get themselves back in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what I enjoyed that was a surprise to me that I did not expect to find in doing it was kind of organically um, the themes of father and son kind of came up more than I expected, with the scenes throughout with him and his father
Mm-hmm.
and how those added like a little, I thought, different level of meaning to certain things and set certain things up in a way that wasn't planned from the beginning. And also even that the black armor itself and the armor, when you've read it now and you sort of just get to that final sort of scene or chef's kiss, if you want, if you will, as he's sort of ruminating on things and where he stands.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it had a little bit more meaning. It wasn't something that I needed to kind of bring a heavy piece of lumber and hit the reader or myself over the head with, but I think it worked throughout. Like, what is
Yeah.
this? What is this thing? Who am I? What does it represent? That sense of assurance on both sides that he kind of explores with himself throughout in
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, a fairly organic kind of way, came forward in a nice way. It's there if you look for it,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't, it's not in the way. It's not in the way of the story. It's not in the way of anything else. But I was very pleased with how all those elements just threaded themselves nicely throughout.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And from those first pages where he's sort of walking on the street and going, "Oh, I can sense what's happening," several floors up, and
Right.
the pizza down the street and things like that. I love that use of the senses. And then again, I don't give it things away on the show, but by issue 3, you really take the character to sort of one of those knockdown, drag out kind of spaces. So, well worth the read and well worth the visit for
Thank you.
listeners out there. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. And they're doing a collection for listeners. If you can't find the individual issues, they are doing a trade collection of all 4 issues, which will be out in May 7th, I believe.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And they've been great sellers. So I will say there were a few delays as I was getting,
oh, really? Oh,
as I was
oh,
getting some
that's nice
copies.
to hear.
Yeah,
Okay.
there were at least a couple of weeks there where I had to wait a little bit because they
Oh,
were going through a second printing and things like that. So,
I'm
uh,
sorry you had to wait, but I'm
well,
I'm
it
glad to
made
hear
it sweeter. It made it even better
that.
that I had to wait. It was okay. Yeah, so wishing great success on the trade as well when it comes out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So my final question, and of course we can
Yep.
hit anything that we've missed about the process or any of that.
Hmm.
I always ask about what's got your attention at the moment. You might be taking some rest after a series, but just curious if there's anything you can mention there, as well as spaces where people can connect and follow along.
Sure.
Your Instagram space is wonderful. I've seen so many action figure call outs with Daredevil and things like that. That's been really entertaining.
I did enjoy 120. I committed to 30 days before the first issue came out to the day the last issue came out. There was a post a day,
Yeah,
and many of
yeah.
those were my little action figure fumettis. So they were fun to do. Um, I am doing surprisingly, a short 10-page story for Marvel,
Great,
which
great.
was a sort of a build on what we just saw, build, and by that I mean it came out of this experience. So
Mhm.
I can't talk about what that is quite that yet. I'm not supposed to. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
But that there's a publisher called Black Box, which is a small independent publisher that has quite a few titles. I think they have about 15, 20 different titles, but they've asked me to do two series. So I'm working on two series for them. One is a sort of a cyber heist type of near future, type of thriller,
Mhm.
which is a lot of fun. The other one is a bit of a sword and sorcery sort of tale. So kind of two genres that are a little bit different for them and for me. So I'm working on those. Um, my friend Mark Nelson, who's famous for his aliens work and a lot of game work and other things, we were talking recently, and he just the conversation inspired an 8-page werewolf story that I wrote just because it came to me and I couldn't get it out of my head. So if anybody wants to illustrate an 8-page werewolf story, it's looking for a home.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I am on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, and Instagram.
Used to call it
Chichester, also Threads. We're looking for the new, what's the new social thing, but I'm on there. I have a Kickstarter comic of my own, which is called Axel's Infernal, which is sort of like a grindhouse um, supernatural thriller that we had one issue that came out near to Christmas, a little after Christmas. It was funded, and we're working on the second issue of that. And then I have a newsletter which I'm terribly behind on doing anything with. But if anybody wants to check it out, and hopefully I can get back to it, it's called storymaze.substack.com. They can find me there.
Awesome, awesome. Well, you are a busy, busy person. Lots of projects and ideas
Yeah,
cooking, so glad to hear that
it's
as
good
well.
to do that.
Yeah. Did we miss anything that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
No, 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 no. I think that's all I have to contribute to the conversation. So unless any of this led to a new question that you want to ask, but that's fine.
All right, all right. Well, glad to have you back anytime.
Thank you again. It's
To,
very
yeah,
nice to come back after the run of it and feeling the whole thing kind of actually more or less stuck the landing, which I do think it did.
absolutely. I would agree with that. And nice to have the bookend experience, but glad to have you back anytime to talk about other projects as well, or to dig
Fabulous.
into something else.
Fabulous. And I'll keep you abreast of what's going on with stuff. Thank you for the opportunity.
Anytime, anytime. Thanks so much.